I raised my grandson from the time he was 2 years old. And when I say I raised him, I mean I did the heavy, unseen lifting of love. I changed the diapers in the dead of night when the house was silent and cold. I taught him how to balance on a bicycle in the driveway on a Saturday morning, the pavement still slick and dark from the rain the night before. I was the one kneeling on the bathroom tiles when he lost his first tooth, holding a damp washcloth to his mouth while he cried, terrified because he thought something was fundamentally broken inside him. I held him. That is the truth of it. My son never came back to do it. That is the part people struggle to grasp when I try to explain the shape of my life. They hear that a son left his child with his father, and their minds naturally soften the edges. They picture a rough weekend, a temporary lapse in judgment, a young man who wandered off the path but eventually found his way back to the porch. They don't picture a Tuesday afternoon in October. They don't picture my son leaving his boy in my kitchen, saying he needed to handle something out in the world, and driving away in a battered truck that didn't even belong to him. I stood at the living room window, my hands resting on the cold glass, and watched the red blur of his taillights dissolve at the end of my gravel road. Behind me, my grandson Miles, because that is the name he was given, was sitting quietly on the faded linoleum floor. He was dragging a green plastic dinosaur across the tiles. He didn't even look up when the engine noise faded. That was 11 years ago. I want to set the record straight about who I am before we go any further. I am 67 years old. For 32 years, I worked maintenance for the county. I cleared roads, fixed drainage pipes, and kept heavy equipment running. I am not a man of complex philosophies. I don't have a lawyer on retainer, nor do I have inherited wealth or societal leverage in this world. My assets are simple. A house I finally paid off in 2019, a 1998 Ford that runs without a knock, a neighbor named Gus who has been my absolute closest friend since our 40s, and a boy who looks at me and calls me Pop. My son, Derek, was 24 when he left Miles with me. He was never a stable boy. My late wife, Norma, used to say Derek came into this world with the volume turned all the way up and just never found the knob. She loved him fiercely, even the hard and broken parts. But when she passed away, Derek shattered. He became a ghost of a man, floating through jobs that lasted a month and phone numbers that disconnected without warning. Then he showed up with a woman I didn't know and a 2-year-old boy with Norma's exact eyes, ate at my table, put the kid to bed, and vanished with the morning sun.
You're staring out that front window again, like you expect that beat-up truck to come rolling back down the gravel.
Not expecting it, just remembering it. It's hard to shake the anniversary of a Tuesday in October. 11 years, Gus.
11 years since he left that boy on your linoleum floor. I remember coming over that Wednesday evening. You looked like a man who'd just been handed a ticking bomb and didn't know how to read the timer.
I felt like it too. 56 years old, trying to remember how to put a toddler to sleep. I was terrified I was going to break him. He was so incredibly quiet.
Kids know. They don't have the vocabulary for it yet, but they know when the ground shifts beneath them. He was a watchful little guy. Still is, sometimes.
It was the routine that saved us both. Enrolling him in the pre-K program over on Clement Road, waking up at the exact same time, pouring the cereal.
I remember the milk. If you poured a single drop too much, he'd just stare at the bowl like it was a foreign object.
Exactly the same amount of milk every single morning. He needed to know that one thing in his world wasn't going to change without warning. He needed to be read to at night. He'd follow me out to the yard, handing me wrenches and trowels, having no earthly idea what they did.
He just wanted to be next to you. You were the only solid thing left standing in his life.
By the time he was 5, he stopped asking about Derek completely.
And how did that sit with you?
I don't even know how to put words to it. It broke my heart for him, but it was also a relief. Is it a terrible thing to admit that I was relieved my grandson forgot his own father?
It's not terrible. It's survival. You stepped up. You became the father. You went to every single one of those junior wrestling matches at the rec center.
Those plastic bleacher seats do no favors for my knees anymore.
But you sit there anyway, smelling like stale sweat and gym mats, cheering until your voice gives out. He looks for you, you know. Every time he wins a round, his eyes shoot straight to where you're sitting in the crowd.
I see him. I always make sure he knows I see him. It's just, sometimes I think about Derek. I called him 17 times that first week. 11 straight to voicemail, 6 just rang out into nowhere. After 30 days, I just stopped counting.
You did what you had to do. You built a life for the boy. Norma would be incredibly proud of the young man Miles is becoming. And she'd be proud of you.
I hope so. I really do. because when I look at him now, grinning with his trumpet or eating his cereal, I know I'm not just keeping him. I'm raising him. He's mine. I heard from my son exactly 4 times over the span of 11 years. It is a strange and heavy thing to count the echoes of a living person, to tally them up like rare, bitter currency, but when a man vanishes from his own life, you remember every single time the ghost decides to make a sound. The first time was a collect call from a holding facility in another state. I accepted the charges, standing in the kitchen while the automated voice droned on. We spoke for exactly 8 minutes. He wept into the receiver, a wet, ragged sound full of terror and self-pity, and I stood there and listened to the static crackle across state lines until the machine cut us off. He was gone again. The second time was a crumpled postcard mailed from somewhere in the arid expanse of the Southwest. It had a picture of a generic canyon on the front and no return address on the back, just a few scribbled words that meant nothing. The third was a text message that materialized on my phone late on Christmas Eve, glowing in the dark of my bedroom while Miles was fast asleep down the hall, dreaming of the morning. The text said only, "Sorry, Pop." I typed back a reply, my thumbs shaking slightly over the illuminated screen, but the message bounced back. The number had already been disconnected. The fourth time, however, was not a fleeting shadow. The fourth time was a certified letter from an attorney's office located in Stillwater. That letter arrived on a frigid Friday morning in February. The timing of it felt like a cruel joke because my heart had been so full the night before. Miles had played in his middle school band concert. He plays the trumpet, and the truth is he is genuinely good at it. He has a natural ear and a quiet dedication that always astonishes me. I had driven home that morning from dropping him at school, still feeling that lingering, quiet pride in my chest, still wearing the heavy winter coat I'd thrown on against the wind. I was standing in the exact same kitchen where Derek had abandoned him, ripping open the thick, expensive paper of the envelope. The letter was drafted by a man named Clifton Webb. It coldly, methodically informed me that my son Derek was seeking immediate custody of his minor child. It formally requested that I cease and desist any further interference in their so-called reunion. The document went on to state in sharp, mechanical legal jargon that if I did not voluntarily surrender the boy within 14 days, I would face severe legal action, including charges of custodial interference and unlawful detainment. I stood there in my heavy coat and read the paper 3 times. By the third time, my legs had given out and I was sitting at the kitchen table. People always want to know what a moment like that feels like. They expect a description of immediate explosive anger or a rush of blinding panic. But the honest truth is that I didn't feel anything at all right away. It is exactly like the moments you slip with a sharp blade in the garage. There is a terrible suspended second, sometimes 2 or 3 seconds, where you look down and see the deep cut in your flesh. You know the tissue is severed, you know exactly what has just happened, but the nerves haven't registered the trauma yet. The agony is still traveling to your brain. That was how I felt. I could see the words. I could comprehend the threat. I just hadn't felt the blood spilling out of my life yet. And then the front door rattled open, and Miles walked in, dropping his heavy backpack by the door. He looked at me, completely innocent of the atomic bomb resting on the table, and asked if he could have a snack. I quietly folded the letter, slid it deep into my coat pocket, forced my voice to remain steady, and said yes. That evening, after I had checked the hallway and made sure Miles was soundly asleep, I picked up the phone and called Gus. I didn't need comforting. I needed the steady, unshakable foundation of a man who didn't panic. I read the legal threats to him in a hushed voice. There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. When Gus finally spoke, he didn't offer empty sympathies. He approached it like a structural collapse. He asked me if I had documentation. He reminded me that I had spent 4,000 days raising this boy, feeding him, clothing him, and healing his fevers, and he demanded to know if I had anything concrete to prove that Derek had left him with me, intentionally. As I sat in the dim light of the living room listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I began to take mental inventory of our entire existence. I realized that my love had inadvertently left a massive paper trail. I had his medical records dating back to his very first pediatric visit that November, listing me as his sole legal guardian. I had the pre-K enrollment forms with my signature pressed hard in blue ink. I had a chaotic drawer in the spare room overflowing with every report card, every permission slip, and every immunization record. But then, a memory pierced through the fog of my panic. 3 months after Derek had driven away in that truck, when the devastating reality set in that he wasn't coming back to reclaim his mess, I had gone into town to see a lawyer named Paulette. I hadn't gone to strip him of his rights. I just desperately needed to know how to navigate the system so I could take the boy to the doctor without fear, she had instructed me to put my intentions in writing. We had drafted a simple, clear letter stating that Derek had voluntarily abandoned the child in my care and that I intended to raise him, demanding a response within 30 days if he objected. We sent it via certified mail. I remembered the cold, hard fact that Derek had actually signed the receipt for one of those copies, and he had let the 30 days bleed away into silence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I dropped the phone, leaving Gus waiting on the line, and tore through the kitchen cabinets. Beneath a yellowing, obsolete phone book from 2016 that I had never bothered to throw away, I found it. The thick manila envelope Paulette had given me. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, but holding it felt like holding a shield. I would need that shield sooner than I could have ever imagined. The following 2 weeks were the most harrowing, degrading days of my entire life. Derek and his high-priced attorney filed the formal petition on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, the county's Child Services Department was knocking on my front door. They were two strangers with clipboards, wearing polite, sympathetic expressions that didn't hide the invasive nature of their job. Standing in my own hallway, I was forced to defend the life I had built. I had to endure their clinical questions about my finances, my health, my routines, and my ability to provide, while Miles was upstairs trying to do his math homework. Something inside of me went ice cold. It was a deep, violating chill that took a very long time to thaw. The worst part was sitting helplessly in the kitchen while they took my grandson into the living room behind closed doors. Miles is 13. He is not a toddler who can be distracted by a shiny toy or a juice box. He possesses a quiet, piercing intelligence. When the social worker finally emerged, her face was carefully neutral, but the tension in her shoulders had vanished. She told me Miles had been remarkably cooperative and incredibly articulate about his own feelings. She didn't need to tell me what he had said. Once the strangers finally left and the front door clicked shut, Miles walked into the kitchen and sat directly across from me. He looked at me with those eyes that are so perfectly his grandmother's that it physically aches to look into them sometimes. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He simply looked at me and stated with the absolute, unshakable conviction of a grown man that he wasn't going anywhere. He told me that Derek didn't know him, had never known him, and he didn't care who the man claimed to be. I sat there, staring at the boy I had poured my entire soul into, completely stripped of words. I didn't know how to respond to that level of raw clarity, so I stood up, turned my back to hide my face, and started cooking dinner. We didn't speak of it for the rest of the night, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the heaviest, most profound silence of my life. I heard his declaration echoing in every corner of the house. I heard every single word. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of the following month, an arbitrary square on a calendar that suddenly held the entire weight of my existence. Gus insisted on driving me to the courthouse, and I let him because on a morning like that, the mundane logistics of the world, navigating morning traffic, circling a bleak concrete parking garage, fumbling with quarters for a meter, felt entirely beyond my capacity. I needed a man beside me who could anchor us to the physical earth while my mind was violently tethered to the impending threat. We arrived far too early. The courthouse hallways were vast, echoing corridors of polished stone and institutional fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and frightened. I found a heavy wooden bench outside the courtroom doors and sat down. I was wearing a dark, heavy suit jacket that I hadn't taken out of its garment bag since Norma's funeral. The fabric still fit my shoulders, but wearing it felt profoundly strange, like I had stepped into the skin of another man's tragedy. Gus sat right beside me, our shoulders nearly touching, and he didn't try to fill the silence with hollow, nervous chatter. He just sat there, acting as a human bulwark against the world, which is exactly why he had been my closest friend for 2 decades. Derek arrived exactly 12 minutes before the bailiff was scheduled to open the doors. I hadn't laid eyes on my son in 11 years. My heart pounded a harsh rhythm against my ribs, but when I finally looked at him, he didn't look like the frantic, broken boy who had abandoned a toddler in my kitchen. He looked older, of course, but it was more than just the passage of time. He had filled out, the hollows of his cheeks replaced by a rigid, guarded set to his jaw. He was dressed carefully in new, stiff clothes, his hair neatly combed back. He had the unmistakable, sterile look of a man who had been meticulously coached on how to appear respectable. He glanced down the hallway, saw me sitting there, and immediately averted his eyes. His attorney, Clifton Webb, was a much younger man than I had anticipated. He wore an immaculate, razor-sharp suit and shoes that probably cost more than my first car. Webb placed a firm, steering hand on Derek's shoulder and guided him straight past my bench, shielding him like a handler protecting an asset. Neither of them made eye contact. I watched my son walk past me, completely a stranger, and I thought about the text message on Christmas Eve. Sorry, Pop. I waited for the fury to rise up in my chest. People always expect blinding anger in these situations. But what I felt sitting on that bench was something vastly older, heavier, and far more exhausting than anger. It was grief, a deep, hollow grief for a father and son relationship that had never quite existed the way I had wanted it to. We filed into the courtroom. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the residue of 1,000 broken families. The judge was a stern, silver-haired woman named Hargrove. She peered over the rim of her glasses and ran the room with the brisk, no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen every conceivable variation of human failure and was entirely immune to theatrical displays. Clifton Webb stood up first to make his case, buttoning his expensive jacket with a practiced flourish. He spoke with loud, polished confidence, filling the room with sterile legal jargon. He threw around phrases like biological imperative, paternal bond, and the fundamental right to a family reunion. He spun a beautiful, fictional narrative about Derek's newfound stability, his modest apartment, his part-time job, and his miraculous emotional recovery. Listening to Webb, you would have thought that 11 years of utter, devastating absence was nothing more than a brief, unfortunate detour, a mere rough patch while a young man found his footing. Then Webb turned his attention to me. He systematically diminished my entire life's work. He mentioned that there had been some informal, temporary arrangement between a grandfather and a son, but stressed that because no formal custody decree had ever been rubber-stamped by a court, my claim to the boy was not strictly speaking legal. Through his entire 10-minute speech, Webb never once used Miles's name. He referred to my grandson only as the minor child. It was a deliberate, calculated dehumanization. Then my attorney stood up. Ruth was a woman with iron-gray hair, wire-rimmed reading glasses, and an expression that suggested she tolerated absolutely zero nonsense from anyone, including God himself. She didn't launch into a passionate, fiery monologue. She didn't pace the floor. She simply picked up the worn, slightly dusty manila envelope I had unearthed from my kitchen drawer, walked to the heavy oak table in front of Judge Hargrove, and laid it down. The faint slap of the paper against the wood echoed in the quiet room. Calmly and without a single ounce of melodrama, Ruth began to unpack the architecture of my love. She produced the certified letter from 2014. She presented the green postal receipt bearing Derek's unmistakable signature. She noted the strict 30-day window that had opened and closed with absolute silence. Then she began stacking the weight of 11 years of relentless, documented presence. She submitted a mountain of medical records listing me as the guardian. She submitted a decade of school enrollment forms, parent-teacher conference logs, and emergency contact sheets. She laid down 11 years of county tax returns in which I had legally, openly claimed Miles as my dependent. It was an overwhelming, undeniable fortress of paper. And then Ruth paused. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and said something I had absolutely no idea she was going to say. Her voice was pure ice. Your Honor, I would also like to note for the court's official record that 3 weeks ago, the plaintiff's attorney sent my client a private, unsolicited communication. In this letter, Mr. Webb suggested that this entire matter could be swiftly resolved without the need for litigation if my client simply agreed to a lump sum payment of $40,000 to be understood as compensation for child care expenses. The courtroom was already quiet, but in that moment a vacuum of absolute suffocating silence fell over the room. Ruth calmly placed a final piece of paper onto the judge's bench, the printed communication, fully dated and bearing Webb's letterhead. Judge Hargrove picked it up. She read it in silence. Slowly she lowered the paper, fixing a glare on Clifton Webb that could have shattered glass. Before turning her gaze to my son, she asked Webb if he cared to address the document. I didn't listen to Webb's stammering response. My eyes were locked entirely on Derek. Watched a series of rapid, devastating shifts wash across my son's face, confusion, realization, and then a profound, sickening shock. He looked like a man who had just been violently shoved into freezing water. In that fractured second, I knew the absolute truth. Derek had no idea about the money. The $40,000 had been Webb's grift all along. An attempt to extort an old man disguised as a custody battle. Derek had just realized his high-priced savior was actively trying to sell his own son. Judge Hargrove slammed her gavel and ordered a 20-minute recess. Those 20 minutes felt like 20 years. When she returned to the bench, her face was like carved stone. She did not mince words. She cited the overwhelming documented evidence of long-term voluntary abandonment. She cited the utter failure to respond to the 2014 legal notification. She cited Miles's own stated preferences to the social workers, noting they were entirely consistent with the boy's documented history of stability. Finally, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, she cited the newly introduced evidence of what she called a predatory, thinly veiled attempt at financial coercion. She aggressively denied the petition for a custody transfer. Furthermore, she announced she was formally referring Clifton Webb's extortionate communication to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary review. Then Judge Hargrove lowered her documents, looked over her glasses, and let her gaze sweep across the entire room. "This child has a home," she said, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the law. "He has had a stable, loving home for 11 years. This court sees absolutely no reason to disturb that." I didn't cheer, I didn't weep. I simply leaned forward, placed both of my trembling hands completely flat against the solid, immovable oak of the defendant's table, and pressed down as hard as I could. I just desperately needed to feel something solid beneath me, to know that the earth had finally stopped shaking. The adrenaline leaves you all at once, not in a slow leak, but in a sudden violent rush that hollows out your bones. By the time we walked out of the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped into the biting February air, I felt like I was moving underwater. Gus didn't ask me where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do. He just steered me by the elbow toward his truck, opened the passenger door, and drove us in absolute silence to the old diner out on Route 9. We slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the back, the smell of burnt coffee and frying onions wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. I sat there staring blankly at the laminated menu while the waitress filled our mugs. Gus ordered the patty melt, just ordered black coffee, and then I sat there watching the dark liquid tremble in the ceramic mug, entirely incapable of bringing it to my lips. After a long while, the waitress returned, and I softly told her I'd take the patty melt too. For the first 30 minutes, we didn't touch the reality of the courtroom. We are both men carved from an older block, the kind of men who need a tremendous amount of runway to come around to the emotional core of a thing. So we talked around it.
They're saying my daughter's new house might need the entire plumbing stack replaced before spring. Contractor trying to bleed her dry, I imagine. And I've been looking at that dealership off the interstate, thinking about trading in my rig for one of those newer heavy-duty models. You hear anything about whether the county is finally going to repave that battered stretch of road out past the reservoir this summer?
We talked about the road. We talked about the truck. We meticulously constructed a temporary, ordinary world right there in the booth. Eventually, my hands stopped shaking enough for me to take a bite of the sandwich. The diner began to empty out as the lunch rush faded. Gus took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, set the thick mug down on the formica table, and finally looked at me, peering straight through the armor.
"So, you doing all right now?"
I took a deep breath, feeling the air expand in my lungs for the first time in a month. I thought so. I really thought so.
Miles is a genuinely good kid. He deserves to stay exactly where he is. You know, I sat in that gallery watching that lawyer try to rip your life apart, and I couldn't stop thinking about what would have actually happened in that room if you didn't have that old manila envelope.
I had been thinking about the exact same terrifying alternate reality. I had been thinking about Paulette, the lawyer I had gone to see on a random Tuesday afternoon back in 2014, entirely lost and just trying to figure out how to put a 2-year-old on my health insurance. I had been thinking about her stern, simple advice. Put it in writing, send it certified. I had followed those instructions not because I was a brilliant strategist predicting a legal war a decade later, but simply because it seemed like the responsible thing to do for the boy. I looked at Gus and told him how razor-thin the line is sometimes between losing everything that matters to you and keeping it safe forever.
That right there is exactly why you write things down. You built the wall before the wolf even knew where you lived.
Gus drove me home, dropping me at the end of the driveway with a firm nod. That evening, after the homework was done and the dishes were cleared, I sat down with Miles in the living room. I didn't tell him everything. I spared him the ugly details of the $40,000 extortion attempt. I just gave him the truth in pieces he could carry. I told him the judge had reviewed all the facts and ruled completely in our favor. I looked him dead in his grandmother's eyes and told him he wasn't going anywhere, that this house was ours, and absolutely no one in this world was going to take it from us. He sat perfectly still on the edge of the sofa, letting the massive weight of that permanence settle into his narrow shoulders. He looked down at his hands for a long minute.
"So, what about my dad? What happens to him now?"
I kept my voice incredibly level, refusing to poison the well. "He's alive," I told him. "He's out there somewhere in the world, living whatever life he has chosen. I told him that the door to his father wasn't locked and barricaded forever, should he ever want to open it when he was older.
I don't hate him, Pop. I really don't. I don't know him. He's just a guy.
I know, Miles, that's a fair way to see it, and we left it exactly there. Over the past 11 years, we have gotten remarkably good at leaving heavy things exactly where they need to rest. Later that night, after I heard the rhythmic, even breathing of Miles fast asleep in his room, I quietly unlocked the back door and stepped out into the detached garage. I stood there in the absolute pitch black, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and cut grass. I wasn't searching for tools. I was just seeking a solitary pocket of darkness where absolutely nobody needed anything from me for a few minutes. I leaned against my workbench and thought about Norma. I thought about what she would have made of this agonizing day. She would have been furious at Derek, not the cold, calculated fury I had felt in the courtroom, but a hot, immediate, righteous anger that she would have projected right to the heavens. But I also knew, with aching certainty, that she would have eventually forgiven him. That was the magic of her soul. She could carry the fire and the water at the exact same time. I stood in the dark and remembered the 2-year-old boy sitting on my linoleum floor, dragging a plastic dinosaur, entirely unaware that he had just been orphaned. Then I pictured the 13-year-old boy standing proudly in the third row of the middle school, bleachers the night before the terrible letter arrived, his trumpet gleaming under the gym lights, frantically scanning the crowd until he found my face. He always finds it. I finally went back inside, threw the deadbolt, and went to sleep. The next morning was a miracle of ordinary routine. Miles padded into the kitchen, poured his cereal, and measured out the exact, precise amount of milk he required to face the day. Got into the truck, turned the radio up to a classic rock station, and drove the familiar route to his school. I pulled up to the curb, the heater blasting against the winter chill. He swung his backpack over his shoulder, grabbed the door handle, and hopped out onto the sidewalk.
Later, Pop.
He slammed the heavy door and walked toward the brick building, joining the sea of other kids, never once looking back over his shoulder, exactly the way a secure, loved 13-year-old is supposed to do. I rolled my window down, despite the freezing air, and watched him disappear through the double doors. That is mine, I thought, a fierce, protective warmth blooming in my chest. That is 11 years of my life, and absolutely nobody on this earth is taking that away. I drove home with the windows still down, letting the biting wind whip across my face. The air tasted sharp and incredibly clean. It felt like something I had finally truly earned. Around noon, the phone rang in the kitchen. It was Gus.
Just calling to check the temperature over there. Everything's still standing. You two doing all right today?
I leaned against the counter, looking out the window at the frost melting on the lawn, and told him everything was absolutely fine.
Good. Good. Hey, I talked to the boys at the county garage this morning. They said they're definitely starting the paving on the Reservoir Road in April.
I smiled into the receiver. That was enough for one day. That was more than enough. People ask me sometimes if I am bitter about the hand I was dealt, about the years that were stolen from my quiet retirement, or about the fact that my own son dragged me into a courtroom to defend my right to love my own grandson. I think about that question a great deal more than I ever let on. When you reach 67 years of age, you have seen what bitterness does to a human being. It is like a slow creeping rust in the pipes of a man's soul. It eats away at the foundation until the whole structure collapses from the inside out. The absolute honest answer to their question is no. I am not bitter. And the reason my answer is no has absolutely nothing to do with being a bigger person or rising above it, or any of that polished, therapeutic language people like to use when they want to sound like they have the universe entirely figured out. The truth is much simpler and far less noble than that. Bitterness requires a massive, sustained amount of energy, and I simply do not have that energy to spare. Furthermore, bitterness does not build a single thing that I actually want to live inside. I have a house, a truck, a friend, and a boy who needs me. That is my world, and there is no room in it for the exhausting architecture of resentment. What I have learned over the course of this long, quiet life, not from a profound book of philosophy, and certainly not from anyone standing at a pulpit telling me how to live, is that the silent, seemingly insignificant choices you make when absolutely nobody is watching are exactly the ones that will save you when your entire world falls apart in public. Think back to that random Tuesday afternoon in 2014. I went to see Paulette, sitting in her small office with the smell of stale coffee and old paper, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. I didn't go to that office because I was a brilliant tactician meticulously planning for a brutal courtroom showdown a decade in the future. I went simply because I was a tired, frightened grandfather who didn't know what else to do, and getting some legal advice seemed like the baseline responsible thing to do for a toddler who had no one else. That is it. That is the entire unglamorous reason. Yet 11 years later, her stern advice to put it in writing and send it certified was the absolute only thing standing like a fortress wall between me and losing Miles forever. I think about that incredibly fragile reality all the time. I picture the alternate version of myself, the version who didn't bother, the version who lazily figured it would all sort itself out eventually, the version who left that kitchen drawer empty. That alternate version of me would have walked into Judge Hargrove's courtroom, armed with absolutely nothing but 11 years of pure memory and fierce love. And love, as devastating as it is to admit, does not come with a legal receipt. I have come to realize that love is not just a profound feeling. It is a kind of active, living intelligence. It is an intelligence that has absolutely nothing to do with being book-smart or articulate. It is about the profound discipline of paying close attention to what matters long before you are ever desperate enough to need it. It is about committing to the small, boring, unglamorous, and incredibly careful things. It is sitting down at the kitchen table to draft a formal letter. It is organizing a chaotic drawer of medical files. It is driving into town to sit in a lawyer's waiting room on a Tuesday afternoon when your bones ache and you would deeply rather be anywhere else in the world. You do these things because you possess the quiet understanding that the future is a very real place, even when it feels a million miles away. Derek, God help him, never understood that fundamental truth. I am not saying that to condemn my son or to paint him as a monster. I am saying it because I believe it is the exact psychological fault line that violently split our paths. Derek moved through his entire existence merely reacting to his own immediate impulses and pain. I, on the other hand, tried, however imperfectly, however clumsily, to actively build. And then there is Miles. Miles is the part of this vast, complicated equation that I find myself returning to the most when the house is quiet. He is 13 years old, and he sat in my kitchen and said, without a single ounce of adult coaching, without anyone whispering in his ear telling him what he was supposed to feel, I don't hate him. I just don't know him. That level of staggering emotional clarity at 13 years old is not something you can just pull out of a hat. It is not something you can teach a child directly with a stern lecture. That kind of profound peace only grows in the soil of a child who has been treated with unwavering honesty. It blooms in a boy who has been fed the truth in small, digestible, age-appropriate pieces over the course of a decade, rather than being stubbornly protected from a massive, ugly lie until it inevitably detonates and destroys his foundation. I never once told Miles that his father was an evil man. I never poisoned his mind with my own grief. But I also never looked him in the eye and promised him that his father was coming back. I just gave him the absolute, unvarnished truth as I understood it, year by quiet year in the smallest possible doses that were still honest. Because of that, he grew up with enough solid, unbreakable ground beneath his feet to actually stand up and face the storm when it finally arrived at our door. I have seen firsthand what happens when people make massive, destructive choices driven purely by what they desperately want in a fleeting moment. They chase the money, the dramatic reunion, the legal claim, the outward appearance of a family they never actually put in the agonizing work to build. But I have also seen what happens when you just keep showing up day after day, year after year. Every single sweaty wrestling match, every hurried school morning with the exact right amount of milk, every quiet evening drive with the radio glowing in the dashboard of the truck, all quietly accumulates. It compresses over time into a diamond-hard substance that absolutely no smooth-talking lawyer can argue away, and no seasoned judge can possibly ignore. This does not happen because the universe magically rewards good people. It happens because consistent, daily action over a long enough timeline produces absolute, undeniable evidence of a life actually lived. The manila envelope saved my family in that courtroom. But that envelope only existed in the first place because I had been paying fierce, unrelenting attention to my grandson for 11 years before I ever needed to prove it to state. That is the only piece of wisdom I know for absolute certain. That is the one true thing I would tell anyone out there who is currently in the middle of the trenches, doing the exhausting, quiet, invisible work of loving someone that nobody else sees, and wondering in the dark if any of it actually matters. It counts. I promise you, every single unglamorous day of it counts.